Welcome to our panel on race and guns in America, a conversation about Black gun ownership. My name is Gregory Parks. I'm the Associate Dean of Strategic Development and Professor of Law at Wake Forest University School of Law. Today's discussion will examine how race intersects with a history of gun ownership in America, the roots of the Second Amendment, and the modern politics of guns. Panelists will bring a historical, legal, and social scientific lens to bear on the conversation around Black gun ownership in the United States, which has increased by nearly 60% in the last year, according to the National Shooting Sports Foundation. Our panelists are Philip Smith, founder and president of the National African American Gun Association, Jennifer Carlson, associate professor of sociology and government and public policy at the University of Arizona, and author of the book, Policing the Second Amendment, Guns, Law Enforcement, and the Politics of Race. Robert Cottrol, Harold Paul Green Research Professor of Law at the George Washington University School of Law, and author of the book, Gun Control and the Constitution, the Courts, Congress, and the Second Amendment. Nicholas Johnson, Professor of Law at Fordham University School of Law, and author of Negroes and the book Negroes and the Gun, The Black Tradition of Arms. Simon Wendt, Associate Professor of American Studies at the University of Frankfurt, and author of the book The Spirit and the Shotgun, Armed Resistance in the Struggle for Civil Rights. And David Yamane, my colleague here at Wake Forest University, who is a professor of sociology, who researches and writes in this area and also teaches a class on the sociology of guns. What today's webinar is intended to be is a conversation amongst experts and practitioners. I have some specific questions for the panelists, but the panelists should also feel free to offer their own questions as the discussion goes along. This should be a very relaxed discussion and webinar. Our goal is for about the first hour and a half to have a discussion amongst ourselves based on some initial questions. And then the last half hour, we will be taking your questions via the chat function, but also via Twitter. And I sent an email out to about 650 pre-registrants yesterday. We look forward to a robust conversation. There's no agenda here. I should be honest with you. About a year ago, I owned no guns. Today, I own a lot of guns. And I am a member of the National African American Gun Association and engage almost on a daily basis in a vibrant conversation about firearms with my fraternity brothers in a Facebook group. And should let you know, President Smith is one of my fraternity brothers. With all of that said, let's get into it. So my first question is, since roughly 2016, there's been a drastic uptick in gun purchases with one of, if not the fastest rising ownership demographics being African Americans. What's driven this surge? Anybody can answer.
I think that might be one that's kind of up my alley as a sociologist. I think that, one thing that we should recognize, and people on this panel could speak to this better than I can, but there is a Black tradition of gun ownership in the United States that shouldn't be forgotten. And I think that surveys, I think, underestimate the extent of Black gun ownership in the United States, both because there's a strong reason for African Americans not to say in surveys that they own firearms, given the history of efforts to disarm Black people. And also the fact that mass incarceration has created a situation where there are disproportionately large proportions of African Americans who are prohibited persons who may still own firearms. So that said, I think that this shift that we've seen in American gun culture toward defensive gun ownership makes gun culture much more inclusive in general, to include not just African Americans, but women and sexual minorities. So the fact that we've seen an uptick in African-American legal gun ownership in the recent period, I think reflects that inclusiveness of the desire to own firearms for defensive purposes.
Can I make a comment?
Of course.
And great comments, David. From my perspective, for our organization, the sea of change was 2016, July 6, when Philando Castile was shot. Prior to that, we had members joining in pretty healthy, robust amounts. But when we all saw Philando Castile being shot, that was a tremendously sobering moment for African Americans across the country, because seemingly he was a good guy, had a great job, loved by his family and friends, was doing the right thing, apparently from his perspective, but yet again, he was still shot and killed. And for African Americans across the country, that was a sea change. We now start getting folks that had no prior interest or desire to have a gun starting to email our organization and organizations like mine saying, hey, Phil, I need to get a gun based on what I saw in that video. And the thing about it, with the technology that we have now in the cell phone, we saw the murder happen again and again and again and again. And that really, to me, was the point where we saw the beginning of this huge upsweep of African Americans purchasing firearms.
Other thoughts?
If I can say a few things on that, I think one of the things that you're seeing in some ways tracks what's happened with gun ownership more generally in the population, which is people in rural areas have always owned guns. And so when the Black population was a predominantly rural population, there was a large amount of gun ownership. I think it declined somewhat as the population urbanized. But what we're getting now, and I think this has happened with the population more generally, is less of a traditional ownership of guns for hunting or sporting purposes, and more for purposes of self-defense. I think incidents like Philando Castile, also incidents of police brutality that we see, cause a number of people to raise the question, are we to be solely dependent on a police force that's highly problematic for our protection? And I think more and more people start asking that question and come to the conclusion that, well, no, it's not a good idea, and therefore we do want the means to protect ourselves.
Can I ask about the elephant in the room? To what extent did Donald Trump's election trigger African-American gun purchases? Or not?
I'm skeptical of that, quite frankly. You know, I mean, some people have said that, but look, I think there's always been a sense that we should own guns because of potential attacks by racists, but I don't think that's what's really triggering the increased purchases and the increased willingness to in fact say so. Let me throw out something that we might want to think of. I don't think this is a major factor, but it may very well be a factor. To what extent has Heller and McDonald played something of a role? The idea that now officially there is constitutional protection. The Supreme Court has actually said at long last, this is a right of individuals. The state can go so far, but no further in terms of regulation. And therefore, I mean, one, it cleaned up Chicago and Washington, D.C. in terms of outright prohibitions. But it also said that, you know, prohibitions are suspect, are constitutionally suspect, and that at some point the courts will actually intervene and protect your rights. I don't think it's a major factor, but I wonder if it's a factor.
In light of your note of the word prohibition, let me ask this follow-up question. From the earliest years of colonial America up to and beyond the American Revolution, there were racial prohibitions on gun ownership. Mm-hmm. Can we clarify for our audience what those were?
So I've got some experience in that area. So some of this stems from the early slave prohibitions, but you've got also limitations on free blacks as well. And this continues after the Civil War. And it's not just the sort of de jure limitations, but there were obviously kinds of de facto limits on Black access to firearms. And the manner in which it was administered, interestingly, even pre-slavery, did not always cut along racial lines. So in my book and Bob's work, lots of people have done this. We see sympathetic whites, Quakers, and for example, in Pennsylvania, working to not just assist Blacks, but also helping them as they were fleeing through even free country, helping them access firearms for purposes of fighting off slave catchers who were coming into the North, trying to kidnap people and pull them back south. And thus the famous phrase from Frederick Douglass that a good revolver is the best answer to the slave catchers. So I think it's multifaceted in terms of the different sorts of restrictions that occurred in the various states. And I think that is one part of the sort of textured vision that we need to have of the manner in which people were accessing arms and the utility. It was really quite, I think, diverse.
Yeah, and just if I can jump in there, I mean, I think it's really important to think about this from the prohibitive side of how guns were, kept out of the hands of enslaved peoples and people of African descent and what have you in the early days of the American Republic. But I think it's also important to look at the flip side of that, which is how guns were used to empower whites, not just as gun owners who would, protect themselves and what have you, but also participate in the maintenance of the slave order, of the genocide of indigenous people in western areas of the U.S. So I think it's important to think about it that it's not just who can't have guns, but also who does have guns and what they're kind of entitled to do, what prerogative what prerogatives they have as a result of that. Because I think that's often left out in this conversation about the intersection of race and guns, and particularly in the early the early history of the U.S.
Fantastic.
Another aspect of the early history that I think we have to look at, one of the things I think we often forget is exactly how revolutionary the American Revolution was. And one way that it was revolutionary is that it ended slavery in the North, or put the northern states, I should say, on the path towards ending slavery, because most had gradual abolition statutes or emancipation statutes. This was the first general emancipation in the Western Hemisphere, and it comes in the northern states of the United States. Where that dovetails with our conversation is that the Black people who are freed in the northern states, by and large, are allowed to have arms. And they are armed, and it also becomes the site of the first armed resistance, because what occurs is there's an initial sort of racially liberal phase that occurs in the North immediately after the revolution. For example, all of the northern states allow Black suffrage in the 1780s and 90s, when right after independence is achieved. After the War of 1812, you have a time of tremendous racial reaction, which is occurring in the 1820s and 1830s, and tremendously vicious anti-Black riots, which are starting to occur in northern cities. And it's there that you get the free Black communities who are basically fighting this anti-Black violence, and they're able to do so because they are armed. And this is a history, it's known to people who are students of Northern Black history, but it's not generally known to people who are students of American history or African American history generally. But it's something we need to look at more closely, I would argue.
All right, appreciate that. Can we step back about a generation? So the Second Amendment's ratified December 15, 1791, along with 9 other articles of the Bill of Rights. Was there a racial context that gave rise to the Second Amendment? If so, what is it? And could one of you explain what is the Second Amendment? There may be many non-gun owners on here. What is the language and what's the racial context of the Second Amendment?
Well, the language of a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Look, the racial aspect is a bit complex. First of all, the Second Amendment is basically taking something from the English Bill of Rights, which guarantees the right of Protestants to have arms. And so it's part of the English legal and constitutional heritage that the English settlers come to the United States with. The people who fight the revolution very much consider themselves Whigs. They style themselves after the people who make the English Revolution of 1688. So it's part of the cultural and constitutional heritage of the English settlers who come to America. I think the right to bear arms is strengthened in part because of racial conflict in the colonial era. But that's not the reason why the amendment's there. And as evidence, I would argue, a number of northern states that are in the process of getting rid of slavery also adopt state constitutional provisions guaranteeing a right to bear arms, most notoriously Pennsylvania, which has a very strong right to bear arms provision, and is also, the politics of Pennsylvania is very anti-slavery at that point. They're in the process of getting rid of it, but yet they nonetheless decide they want to preserve the notion of a right to bear arms.
So can I add just one other aspect to what Bob has highlighted? And that is, Greg, you indicated the timing that we're looking at 1791. One of the more abstract aspects to this conversation about the source of the right to arms and the impulse of the right to arms is an idea that gets obscured in the modern era, but was an important source of rights in the 18th century. And that is that the federal government was one of limited enumerated powers. So we get the adoption of the Constitution in 1789. We don't initially have a Bill of Rights, but it didn't mean that individuals did not have rights. They had an array of rights that were protected by the scheme of limited power. And you see commentators in the later part, the early part of the 19th century sort of affirming that structure. That piece gets lost on us. And if we incorporate that idea, it makes, I think, the positivist claim about the impulses for the Second Amendment more textured, more, more nuanced. I mean, it's a longer conversation that I won't drag us off onto that tangent. But one of the pieces I've done in the last couple of years highlights that aspect of the conversation. And if you fold limited power as a source of rights protection into the conversation, it makes the claim about the sort of the racist origin of the Second Amendment, which I think is an idea that has been batted around over the last couple of months. It makes that also more complicated. And again, it's important to appreciate the texture.
Appreciate that. So the main gun shop, range, and training center I go to, as you imagine, it's gotten browner and browner over the past year or so. Honestly, when I first went there several years ago with some colleagues and friends, you know, I'd never owned a gun. I'd shot one maybe once in high school. You know, there are no Black people in there. Now when I go, it's probably about 40 to 50% Black people in there taking classes in the range, buying guns and ammo. And these young and old men and women, those who our military vets who've been in law enforcement and those who've never been. So it creates some interesting conversations now. And I remember one of my main instructors asked me this question. He said, it seems that many white gun advocates also define themselves as Second Amendment advocates as well, while Black gun advocates or owners don't subscribe to that label, Second Amendment advocate, to the same extent. Is this a reality? Are we misreading that this assessment?
I think we subscribe to it, but for African Americans, and I'm speaking from my perspective, I might get disagreement on the panel, but we're trying to survive. We're trying to make it from A to B, first and foremost. The rights, are they a concern of ours? Absolutely, but we're trying to survive literally from day to day. So that's why it seems like our emphasis is elsewhere, as opposed to the verbiage or the language of the Second Amendment and don't tread on me and all this other stuff. We're trying to live.
I think that there's no mechanical connection between the condition of owning a gun and considering yourself a gun owner as an important part of your identity. And I think the political scientist Matt Lacombe has made some good arguments in terms of stressing the importance of the NRA crafting the notion of a gun owner as a political identity that can then be activated. But I think back to my research in the sociology of religion, when more and more Americans, when they were asked what their religion was, they said none. And people concluded that they weren't religious, but what it was that they were reacting to the way that religion was defined in particular. And I think that the kind of co-optation of a lot of high-profile gun rights advocacy by the NRA as a culture warrior organization kind of turns off Second Amendment advocacy for a lot of people who don't come to guns and gun ownership from that kind of conservative political orientation, which would include many African Americans, many LGBT people, liberal gun owners. So, I think that this huge gun buying spree that we've seen by many new and non-traditional gun owners isn't mechanically going to lead to any sort of rise in Second Amendment advocacy, because people have to first see themselves as gun owners as an important part of their identity and then craft that into some sort of political platform, which is, there's a lot that has to go into that happening.
Can I shade the question a little bit? I know we're supposed to be commenting to you, answering your question, but
no. This goes back and forth. Everybody can pose their own questions, weigh in.
So I am, and this is sort of for Phil, but also for David, whose work I was just reading over the last couple of days, and I didn't realize that David was the impulse behind the Liberal Gun Club, but I think I appreciate that now. And so in any case, one of the questions that I have is sort of surrounds the phenomenon of gun rights advocacy or support politically for firearms rights. Becoming being captured by the right, or being captured by supposedly conservatives. But if we move certainly to the 1960s, we saw there a much more diverse set of individuals who claim to support, who would say, I think, would say that they classified themselves as Second Amendment supporters. So it was far more common to find Democrat candidates who would align with the right to keep and bear arms. And one of the things that is intriguing to me is the possibility that the rise of Black gun ownership over the last several years may add again some diversity to the groups that we think of as Second Amendment advocates. I mean, I don't know why this has to be the territory of Republicans and question, I guess, is whether the rise of Black gun ownership may require that the Democrats start to think in a more complex way about how they approached the gun question politically with the rise of groups like Phillips.
Well, let me, if I could just say something on that. at one point, it was by no means a left-right issue. John Dingell of Michigan is the person who sets up the NRA's Institute for Legislative Action. Harold Volkner, helps pass legislation which gives a certain amount of relief to gun owners. If I were to isolate one single incident or one single individual who changes that dynamic, I would argue it's Bill Clinton and the assault weapons ban. That is, Clinton, to pass the '94 crime bill, has the assault weapons ban as a part of it. He essentially strong arms a lot of rural Democrats who had been very much in sync with the NRA, and in fact, who were able to get elected from conservative districts because they had the NRA support. He strong arms them into voting for the assault weapons ban and the crime bill. And that, more than anything else, I think turns it into a left-right issue as opposed to a rural-urban, which it had traditionally been.
Well, if I may weigh in here, and I think Nicholas brought up an important point, and that is, the kind of diversity in terms of how people thought about guns in the 60s and 1970s. And I think along the lines of what Philip said about, just trying to survive, I think in the 60s especially, and in the 70s, a lot of African Americans said, we are for self-defense. So it's not so much an issue about the Second Amendment, but we're for self-defense because we need to defend ourselves against various attacks. So I'm not quite sure whether the question of are they, Second Amendment advocates is the right question, but rather are they self-defense advocates, which is also revolves around guns, but is not so much about the Second Amendment, but rather about, how to survive on a daily basis. So I think we should also talk about the issue of self-defense as opposed to just focusing on the Second Amendment.
Fast forwarding for a second. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in. I mean, I think it's interesting because the Black Panthers very explicitly talk about the Second Amendment. I mean, it's not the case that the Second Amendment isn't discussed in that era of Black power mobilization at all. And I think this is really intriguing. And I think this whole conversation really speaks to, again, just how multifaceted and nuanced, whether we want to call it American gun ownership, American gun culture, gun politics really is. And I think, I think it's really important actually to also not remove the Second Amendment from the equation, because I think going back to the sort of first round of our questions and comments, gun ownership is about survival. It is about self-protection. It is also about engagement in full citizenship, right? Like gun rights as a practice is a practice of citizenship. And I think that is where I think Heller really matters, is that it broadens this idea of gun rights as being at the same level as First Amendment, Fifth Amendment, what have you. And so, when I did my research in Detroit, in Metro Detroit and the surrounding areas in Michigan, I interviewed and hung out with open carriers, concealed carriers. And it was really, it was really striking how much sort of the conflation of this is about self-preservation. So, African-American gun carriers, open carriers in Detroit, the city of Detroit, really, putting together the capacity, the ability to practice fully the right to self-defense as an act of not just, enacting citizenship, but also modeling it for other people in their community. And so I think that's, I guess that's I don't want to cede the Second Amendment because I think it's important to keep that focus on rights and citizenship and how that percolates and matters differently in different sort of corners of gun culture. But yeah, the other thing I wanted to add too is that I think this is really, this conversation also really highlights why it's important to talk about not just what people believe about guns, but also what they do with their guns. And that's obviously changed dramatically with sort of, people have talked about it. I've talked about it as sort of the concealed carry revolution, the massive shift in state level laws and the practice of guns as objects that you carry in your everyday life, rather than, something you store under the bed, you lock up and take out only for hunting, hunting season. And so what's interesting is part of the precondition of that is, the sort of rise of the NRA and sort of its transformation post 70s. We see with that, obviously tighter linkages as David David has noted, and Matt Lacombe's work is really great for seeing this transformation in the NRA as more and more tightly linked to the Republican Party. But then what concealed carry does is actually something really different, which is sort of broaden the appeal of guns well beyond the Republican base. And so it's really interesting to see sort of how those two sort of strains have unfolded. And so, I think it's very important to again, think of gun culture or gun politics or whatever you want to call this phenomenon as something that's very textured, very nuanced. David's work highlights that 1 in 5 gun owners identify as liberal, which I think a lot of people would be surprised to hear that because there is such a stereotype of, the gun owner in sort of, in political as well as racial and gender terms.
Can I just add one point about the question? So we started talking about the Second Amendment, and I think it's just useful here to highlight the idea that the notion of what the Second Amendment does or is about at its core is contested, first of all, and has shifted over time. So for people who are looking at this from the outside, and even from academics who are engaging this conversation currently, the earlier sort of militia-centric concept from the 1780s shifted dramatically during the Reconstruction era after the 14th Amendment. And then during the 20th century, we have had multiple different versions of what the Second Amendment means. So part of this conversation can be sort of illuminated by appreciating that there is that contested, shifting set of arguments about what the Second Amendment even entails. So for people who are not legal academics, people who are not academics may have their own conception of what it means to be a Second Amendment advocate. And those differing conceptions, I think, may add a bit of noise to the conversation about whether Blacks think about themselves as Second Amendment advocates or not. I think different people have different views about what that means.
Excellent. Let me keep with this sort of line of discussion and stay contemporary for a moment. What should the Democrats be doing now around gun rights, given that African Americans tend to be the most loyal demographic group to the Democratic Party? You see a significant rise in gun ownership amongst African Americans. Should the Democrats be rethinking their policy positions and their rhetoric on gun ownership? And if so, any recommendations for what they should be doing?
I think they should. I think they should be looking at the population of the African Americans. I mean, at no point in history, you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, we've had this many African Americans with guns. I don't think that we can call this a renaissance, but it's certainly an awakening within our community. And with that said, if I'm a Democratic leader or a politician, I'm certainly going to look at the trends and where people are going in terms of what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And you look at the numbers of African Americans that are buying guns, I would tread carefully. If you keep promoting a anti-gun, or that's my estimate, an anti-gun sentiment, how that's going to be felt by your base of African Americans who are buying guns. And that's kind of a contradiction. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to friends, colleagues, members of NAGA about this very thing. I vote Democrat, but the person I'm voting for is really not a gun advocate or promoting the Second Amendment. And it's a battle, it's a fight. Long term, I think they need to rethink their strategy when it comes to messaging, when it comes to firearms, specifically to African Americans.
Even putting race aside, you have to wonder how this became a Democratic hobby horse, because not only is it alienating, has the potential to alienate new African American gun owners, it's alienated blue collar white citizens, a whole range of people, and one has to ask, to what end? These policies do not reduce crime. They do not make communities safer. Some of them are downright silly. For example, an assault weapon rifle is defined as a rifle with a bayonet lug. Are we really afraid of bayonet crime in this country? Or is this just a policy in search of a rationale, quite frankly.
I think it's incredibly difficult. I'm sorry, Robert, let me cut in here and say this. I think it's incredibly difficult to talk to a single woman who is raising children, who has just purchased a gun, and then she turns on the TV and her representative in the local area is talking about how guns are bad. That can't persist. To me, you're starting to disrespect those that are supporting you. And that's just wanted to make sure I added that point.
So I think the other part of your question, Greg, was what sort of advice would one who has the concerns that Philip and others have raised? What sort of advice would you give to politicians who are appreciating the tension between the sort of undercurrent of the gun ban agenda, which is trust the state, trust the police, the tension between that and the reality of policing and criminal law enforcement, and part of it is that there are an array of questions that arise surrounding firearms. The policies that Bob was talking about that I think are clearly demonstrated to have failed are the policies of just these blatant supply controls. That is, we're going to ban handguns in Washington, D.C. and Chicago. So, and supply controls are off the table because of Heller. We still see lots of politicians continuing to press supply controls around the edges. My advice would be to think hard about the different virtues of different sorts of regulation. So there are things that some people could probably agree on, and there are things that are also, I think, in the silly category of the type that Bob highlighted. And for those who are Democrats who are starting to look harder at this question, Democrat leadership or Democrats in the leadership, making a sort of serious effort to get away from symbolism and make a judgment about what is actually viable and what is not, is the direction that I would urge the leadership to move in.
One other question along this lines, right? So one concern about guns and the desire to regulate them more heavily is inner city crime. To what extent has gun control actually reduced crime, especially in inner cities?
I don't think any. I don't think any, because too many times we are taking gun violence and trying to take the term gun control and mesh those two together. Gun rights and gun violence. And they're two entirely different things. People going out and who are law-abiding, buying a gun is totally different from some guy that's robbing and killing folks. You can't take the bad actions and place them on a good person. Over the long term, it doesn't work, and people get very resentful from that. I know a lot of our members do.
And also,
go ahead.
I think one of the things that happens in a lot of highly restrictive areas is that solid citizens who simply cannot get a permit end up being the victims of gun control laws because they're the ones who get arrested. Yes. They get the felony convictions, their lives get ruined. And for the hardcore criminal, it doesn't make a difference. The violation of the gun law ends up being the least of their crimes, and very often is plea bargained out in the process. Interestingly enough, State's Attorney Fox in Chicago has admitted that most of the people who end up being prosecuted for gun crimes are not, in fact, criminals. They're simply people who violated the gun laws, but they're not otherwise involved in the business of criminal activity. And of course, that falls most heavily on Black and Hispanic communities, people who are not very well protected by the state. When they try and protect themselves, they're made into criminals by this kind of law. This has also been indicated in the New York City Public Defender's brief, saying that the number of lives of solid citizens who can't pay the fee that New York has, which is something like $400 to $500 for a permit in your home, never mind carrying, or who can't wait the 6 months that they stall before they finally give you the premises permit, these people get prosecuted. Their prospects for jobs or any kind of benefits in the future get totally ruined. And meanwhile, the hardcore criminal, it does nothing to them.
The other part of the answer to the question is the empirical work that is immensely complicated, but there are a couple of things that are worth raising, at least in this context. First, one can find in most of the empirical work good validation of the fact that there are massive gun thefts that occur every year, and that the inventory of black market firearms is quite high. So the phenomenon that we witnessed in Washington, D.C. and Chicago in the pre-Heller, pre-McDonald era was that there were lots of untrustworthy people who had firearms. So it wasn't that there were no guns in the jurisdiction. It was just that the distribution of firearms tilted so heavily toward those who were untrustworthy. So one of the phenomena that we have to think about is that we're not causing firearms to disappear. We're simply affecting the distribution. So the gun ban generates a distribution of firearms in black neighborhoods that is harmful to individuals who are solid citizens. The other thing that is a general phenomenon that we've seen over the last 20 years, just as a commentary on supply controls, is that during the period when we had this sharp decline in crime that never got publicized, but all of the literature shows that starting in the mid-1990s, we had this period of 15, 20 years where crime was declining. That was also a period where the gun supply was increasing dramatically. And that is one fairly straightforward, uncontestable refutation of the background argument that more guns equal more crime, which was the foundation for some of the policies that started in the 1960s. The empirical work beyond that gets more complicated with regard to how gun control has affected Black communities. But those two pieces, I think, are fairly well agreed upon by people in the research. And what they suggest is that these supply controls of the type that were initiated in Washington, D.C. in the 1970s have not helped Black communities.
Thank you. Can we step back for a second historically? The more things change, the more they stay the same. Makes me think of this next question. So, noted African-American historian Dr. Rayford Logan described the period between Reconstruction and the early 20th century as the nadir, or the low point of American race relations, where you saw a rise in racial mob violence, massacres, and lynchings against Blacks, as well as efforts to disenfranchise them largely, but not exclusively in the South. With the great migration of Blacks to the North, so racial resistance with the rise of sundown towns as an example. How did Black gun ownership factor during this period?
I think.
Can I start this? Either way, Bob.
Okay, go ahead.
So I'll start it, but because this is rich in detail, and several of us, maybe all of us on this panel, have done some work, and certainly everybody here has thought about this. So there are this is such a rich period, and the way you set up the question, Greg, I think causes us to incorporate so many individuals and variables that we're not going to be able to do justice to it. But I will just highlight some things that people have maybe some familiarity with. The period that you're describing is the period out of which we get the famous quote from Ida B. Wells that the Winchester rifle deserves a place of honor in every Black home. And what Wells was describing were two instances recent to her writing of averted lynchings And she goes on to talk about it and says that this gory business continues, and the only exceptions with regard to how these episodes have played out have been instances where Blacks have raised arms in self-defense and defended members of their community. You get similar types of assessments by the T. Thomas Fortune, the editor of the New York Age. And as you move out of the 19th century into the early 20th century, you get similar assessments by W.E.B. Du Bois and countless others. You just go to the Black newspapers at the time and see the manner in which they are responding to all of these outrages and the sort of prescriptions surrounding self-defense that they urge the community to engage in. And again, it is in the background, this idea that we're not trying to engage in a revolution. We are, as Philip was saying earlier, and you were suggesting that the more things change, the more they stay the same. People were just trying to survive a violent episode and deal with the consequences later. So I think that the policies that we see today, or the ideas that we see today, influencing the way that Blacks come to the question of whether they're going to have guns or not, are very much driven by it's a matter of a difference in degree, obviously, but very much driven by this sort of assessment of state failure and the need for self-help.
I should also add that the state failure is mandated from the top. We should spend more time looking at the case, the 1876 case of United States versus Cruikshank, where a Klan-like mob descends on a group of Black men who are trying to vote, massacres them. The leaders of the mob are brought to trial, criminal trial, by the federal government, which charges them with, among other things, violating the Second Amendment rights of these men, because the men went to the polls armed, knowing that this Klan-like group was going to attack them. And basically, the Supreme Court said, well, this is really none of the federal government's business. If you want protection, you need to go to the state government. And of course, the state government's in the hands of your enemy. So you have the federal government saying to Black communities in the South and elsewhere, you're on your own. We, the federal government, cannot protect you, on a series of bogus constitutional arguments, which I won't go into. So basically, from that date in 1876, really until the second Reconstruction in the 1960s, the federal government is out of the business of protecting the civil rights of Black people from the Klan and similar organizations. If people had not been armed, if they had been totally helpless, the Jim Crow era would have been significantly worse. It was bad as it was, but imagine if one had to face the Klan and similar organizations without any ability to defend oneself. So I think that the presence of arms in Black communities made a tremendous difference, as it did in the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. You know, it's interesting, just as a personal note, one of the things that got me to be a Second Amendment advocate, Second Amendment supporter, it started very early in my life. It started when I was about 11 or 12. And three things came together at the same time. We didn't own guns in our home. You know, I lived in New York City, in East Harlem. We didn't have guns. We didn't know any people who did, or at least none who admitted it. But in any event, I became fascinated with three things that hit me at the same time. One, the Boy Scout handbook, for some point at that point in time, talked about the Second Amendment and the ability of the people to resist tyranny. I also read a fascinating article. I'm dying to get my hands on it because I haven't been able to find it anywhere, and I've Googled it to death, but still haven't found it. What if Otto Frank had a gun? And if any of you have been to Amsterdam and been to the Anne Frank house, the attic where they stayed, it is the most physically defensible position I have ever seen. You cannot rush it. You cannot go up 2 or 3 at a time. You have to go up a very narrow staircase, holding on to the banister to get into that attic. You know, I didn't know that at the time, but I just simply read What If Otto Frank had a gun. And then finally, I read Robert Williams's Negroes with Guns. You know, it was interesting growing up in New York. My teachers said, you know, what a great idea it would be for gun licensing, if not gun prohibition. And I sort of thought, well, if I lived in the South, would I want to go to my sheriff and be dependent on him to give me a license? So I was always the dissenter in those conversations in the classroom. But Williams was very important in terms of forming my view, and this was long before I ever picked up a gun.
With that said, does someone want to talk about who Robert Williams was? Because he's an interesting figure. How does his philosophy and work highlight the complexities of Black gun ownership and civil rights advocacy during the heart of the civil rights movement?
Well, sure. I'll talk about it just a little, just because it helps. The Williams story is useful in terms of the framing of several things that I've done. But so Robert Williams was an advocate of Black civil rights, and he became the president of the Monroe County, North Carolina NAACP. There are a variety of good works that focus purely on Williams. I talk about him in detail in a variety of places. The significant early thing about Williams is, so he had this military experience. He goes to Monroe, back home to Monroe, where things are changing. So in the early to mid 50s, Blacks are sort of raising their heads. They're standing up against a variety of injustices. One episode involved Williams and Black men in the community protecting with guns Dr. Albert Perry, who was an activist who was getting sort of central to the NAACP chapter there. Perry was being attacked by a Klan-like gang, and Black men with guns defended Perry's life. They did a similar sort of intervention to prevent one of the members of the communities from being prevent his grave from being desecrated. But the most significant thing about Williams, in terms of directly answering your question, Greg, is that Williams, after a particular episode where a white man who raped a Black woman was acquitted, made some inflammatory remarks that the NAACP considered to be over the line, the traditional line between political violence and private self-defense. And that sanctioning by the NAACP kicked off this nationwide debate between Williams and Martin Luther King, for example, between Williams and the NAACP. And it is just this rich conversation within the community about the importance of armed self-defense, the legitimacy of armed self-defense on the one hand, and the boundary against political violence on the other. And the exchange of essays between King and Williams include even Martin Luther King saying, well, of course, self-defense is legitimate. The thing that we have a problem with is political violence. And then we end up with the community sort of engaged in this conversation about how to draw the line and how careful to be, how far away from the line of political violence one needs to be. So Williams, that's one aspect of Williams' importance, and there are others that I think Bob and Jennifer and a variety of others may want to highlight.
Simon, you've done some great work in this area and during this period. You want to add your thoughts about some of the paradoxes that we might see with regards to traditional civil rights leaders and activists, but to Nicholas's point, they believed in armed self-defense on the other hand.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Robert F. Williams is an important bridge figure, really, because he was one of the earliest advocates of self-defense. And then later we see organizations like the Deacons for Defense and Justice, or a self-defense organization that was founded in Tuscaloosa, Alabama in 1964. And all of these self-defense organizations actually cooperated with non-violent civil rights organizations, such as the Congress of Racial Equality or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And what's fascinating really about these self-defense organizations in the South in the 1960s is that they had no problem marching in nonviolent protests, but then would protect civil rights activists at night or would patrol the neighborhoods, including, by the way, Martin Luther King in the 1950s. So I think it's interesting how nonviolent protest and self-defense kind of worked in tandem and sometimes in tension in the 1960s, and in many ways contributed to the success of the civil rights movement. And one thing that I would like to add here is that Robert rightly pointed out that without arms, African Americans around 1900 would have been left, defenseless, and quite often could prevent lynchings or could prevent white attacks. At the same time, quite often, self-defense, Black self-defense, that is, triggered white retaliation. So those African Americans who would defend themselves quite often saw themselves confronted with white attacks, not only on individuals, but on Black communities. And that is something that really changed in terms of continuities and change. That really changed in the 1960s. So the Deacons for Defense and Justice, for example, who were founded in 1964 in Jonesboro, Louisiana, and became famous when they protected the Congress of Racial Equality in Bogalusa, Louisiana, they were not disarmed. One of the only integrated places that you could found in Bogalusa, Louisiana in 1964 was the line where white and Black people would buy ammunition. And they would just stand in line together, right? White and Black, and so the tensions were really high there. And so what you saw really in terms of the differences is there was no retaliation. So no white retaliation against the Deacons or against the self-defense organization in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And I'm still trying to figure out, by the way, as to why that was, right? Was it because there was so much focus on these communities? Because maybe 15, 20 years earlier, the communities, meaning the white authorities, would have disarmed the Black community, would have disarmed these Black self-defense organizations. But that took not place in the 1960s. I'm still trying to figure out as to what white politicians and white police officers, what they were thinking in terms of, we can't do it. We can't disarm these people. And the Second Amendment obviously plays an important role here, but I'm still kind of puzzled, as to the difference between, armed self-defense in the early 20th century and then armed self-defense, Black armed self-defense, that is, in the 1960s.
I think a lot of people know of the Black Panther Party for self-defense, but not the Deacons for Defense. What were the similarities and differences between these organizations, especially around firearms? Open to anybody.
All right. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, isn't one of the differences that the Panthers were trying to sell a whole sort of revolutionary program that, either outright said or suggested that we're going to overthrow the government of the United States. The Deacons were far more modest. They simply said, we want to protect our community. And I would argue they were more successful in part because they were less well known. They had a low profile. They simply defended their communities. The people in the communities, white and Black, knew that they knew what they were doing with guns. The Panthers, were big box office, banner headline, we're here to overthrow the government. And I think they were ultimately far less successful.
I agree. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I agree. Go ahead now.
I'll be there. There is one episode. This is in, I forget whose book this is in, but a fellow named Sims, I can't remember his first name, is on a tour out in California. He meets with some of the Panthers, and his expressed assessment is that we have a different agenda from the Panthers, and it's basically the distinction that Bob is highlighting. But there's a fairly sort of rich quotation there suggesting why it was that Sims considered the Panthers and the Deacons to really be operating in different directions.
Does anybody want to talk about the Jennifer, go ahead. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
I'm going to put, I think I know exactly what you're referring to. There's a great article by a historian by the last name of Strain. It's Charles Sims, and I'm going to put the quote he has from Charles Sims about the Black Panthers with the link in the chat.
Anybody want to talk about the Mulford Act?
I mean, I'm happy to talk about it since, sorry, I think I froze. Am I good to go?
You're good to go.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I mean, I think the Mulford Act is, to speak to Simon's question of sort of how do we make sense that there was no action taken, against the Deacons for defense to disarm them, for example. What we see when we flip to the north, when we flip to urban communities in the north, such as Oakland, there's a really different politics of law and order that gets activated to immediately move or very quickly move to disarm armed African Americans who are organized, collectively organized on the basis of through their arms. So I think that that's actually really striking to make that comparison. That being said, though, I think it's important. So the Mulford Act, basically, Mulford was the name of the California legislator who basically, that he was a legislator from Oakland, Alameda County, where the Black Panthers were founded in the 1960s. And basically that law was very much crafted to ensure that the Black Panthers could not openly carry loaded firearms. So it did not affect hunters. It did not affect people who were possibly, Nazis, Minutemen, Ku Klux Klan, or white supremacist organizations organized in non-incorporated areas in California. And he was when you read his commentary, it's very clear that this wasn't, accidentally written this way. This was very much about disarming Black power groups, particularly the Black Panthers. What I find pretty interesting about this is that it is kind of at this really interesting turning point in the 1960s. We are, about to embark on the war on crime. We're about to shift into what Michelle Alexander calls the new Jim Crow, which is a system of racial domination through the politics of law and order. And in some ways, I would actually argue that even though Mulford comes at this transitional moment, in some ways, Mulford looked a lot more like the Jim Crow gun laws, where it was very much about using law to disarm African Americans in a pretty explicit, about as explicit as you could do without violating constitutional protections by the letter of the law. What we see in the post-1960s period, and I think this goes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the criminalization of otherwise lawful people through gun policy, is you see that gun control takes the form of gun criminalization. And so actually I would say that Mulford is, even though it's kind of seen as the start of this war on crime period, it's actually more of a relic that belongs, I think, more in the Jim Crow era, whereas what we see in terms of gun restrictions and how to make sense sense of sort of gun restrictions that operate through race, it's really, for example, the assault weapons ban, that was very much motivated. If you look at Daryl Gates, who was LAPD police chief, it was all about racist language, race, a sort of racist war on crime. You can hear the types of things he was saying to justify why aggressive disarmament was so necessary and the banning of these guns was so necessary. And a lot of that had to do with police seeing themselves as victims, not seeing everyday victims of gun violence as victims. So that's a bit of my thoughts on Mulford.
Thank you. Are there different things driving gun ownership amongst Black and white Americans? Especially what the empirical social science might tell us on this?
I mean, I think that the answer is pretty much no. I mean, today, the primary reason people say they own firearms is for personal protection and self and family defense, and that cuts across racial groups, gender groups, sexuality. That I think that you can't really even say that there are more interest in gun culture 1.0 activities like hunting, because there's very rich traditions of African American hunting. So but the majority of people today say they own firearms for self-defense, and that cuts across racial groups for sure.
Who are they, and maybe this is a loaded question, who do they see themselves as defending themselves from?
So that's really intriguing, and I've been thinking about, I haven't produced the work here, but I've been thinking about this threat narrative question, or at least that's the way that I've framed it. And it strikes me that interracial violence is the most compelling or evocative threat narrative, even though it's true that most violence is intra-racial for Blacks, whites, and browns. And so I guess what I think is that people are thinking about a different set of threats when they think about arming, that they're thinking about a different set of threats than the ones that are likely. And this is just my surmise. And I don't know that there's a lot of work on this. I have, over the last several years, thought about this question, thought I was going to include it in a separate or in a new book. And I just haven't managed to corral the theme. So I'm just sort of articulating a kind of vague response to your question based on my sense that the most evocative, compelling, fearful sorts of threats are the interracial ones, even though numerically those are not the ones that generate as many attacks, but they loom larger, it seems to me.
Thank you.
I think one of the things, can I just say that one of the things
Yeah.
underlying that is just a general sense of uncertainty, right? So you can ask people, what are you afraid of? And they'll come up with reasons for, what they're afraid of. But, last year was the year of general uncertainty, going from COVID, rolling into the protests surrounding the George Floyd murder, rolling into presidential election that was, crazy. And so, in the same ways that people hoarded toilet paper and hand sanitizer, I think that guns gave people a sense of ontological security last year, regardless of what particular threat they thought they were facing.
Could I interject maybe a discordant note here, if I might? I'm very much a hardcore Second Amendment advocate, and I come at it from a position of we should simply not give the state a monopoly of arms, that it's a dangerous thing to do. Okay, so even regardless of what one might say about the racial makeup of who are victims and who are not, the crime situation at any given point in time, I would simply say it's a bad idea to give the state a monopoly of force. End of sentence. Okay, that having been said, let me try and make the case for the other side for a moment, which is, if I were a gun control advocate, and specifically addressing the issue of race and guns, I would say, look, we've got to do something. The black on black homicide rate is simply off the charts. That we have a homicide rate of something on the order, I believe, of 4 per 100,000 for the population at large. And something like for young black men between 15 and 24, whatever the magic ages are, it's in the 80s. It's totally off the chart. And so therefore the people who are saying, well, let's ban Saturday night specials, which was the big thing in the 70s, or guns in public housing, or whatever, particularly something that might be racially targeted, as I think both of those were. It may have been misguided, but nonetheless, they were addressing a real problem that we have to somehow face and somehow put into our discussion. So what do we say to that? That yes, everything we've been saying has been true. Guns were important during the Jim Crow era. They played a role in warding off the Klan and similar groups. But whatever was true 70 years ago, the issue today is black on black crime, particularly with respect to young black men. Are we giving the gun control people their due in this conversation? And mind you, I say that as somebody who's a hardcore Second Amendment absolutist. I'm in favor, I believe in individual gun ownership, regardless of what the statistics may or may not say about who owns guns or what kind of crimes are being committed, et cetera. That having been said, what do we have to say about the astronomically high rates of violence in Black communities?
Bill, you're on mute.
Sorry, had myself on mute. I think to Robert's point, I'd like to add why we need to ask the question, why are those gentlemen and ladies killing themselves in various areas of the country? What's the motivation or the factors that are pushing them to shoot each other? And I believe it's an economic issue that needs to be addressed. Because if you look at areas like South Central on the East Coast, South Side Chicago, and even in Southwest Atlanta, where I'm located, certain factors are consistent in all those areas. Very bad schools. The individuals in those areas have no connection to the larger population. They have a pipeline to prison from their school educational system. They have a confrontational relationship with the police at best, and I mean at best. So what are you going to do if you can't get a job? You have 3 or 4 felonies by the time you're 24. You know what you're going to do? You're going to do what I would do if I was in the same situation. You're going to rob, you're going to shoot, you're going to do whatever you have to do to feed your kids at home. And yes, you're going to use a gun if necessary. So if you want to solve the issues, really solve the issues, let's look at the economic solutions to those problems, because we've tried everything else and none of those issues are really working, or none of those solutions have worked thus far. Let's be solution oriented and really look at the problem. And it's very difficult. It's not a silver bullet answer, but we have to be very, very specific about what's really going on in those areas.
I would just add that there is work. So, for example, David Kennedy's book, the name of which I can't remember now, and the sort of programs coming out of the Harlem Children's Zone. There are a variety of moderately successful interventions that we have identified in particular municipalities. The problem, or one problem, has been scaling up. And some of these things seem like they are resistant to scaling. But I think what Philip is indicated is that that there are a variety of real potential answers. But one of those that is not an answer is the sort of pipe dream that you are going to impose a broad supply control on particular types of communities and prevent people who are already prohibited from owning firearms from getting firearms. All you're doing there is saying that Philip and people like him, who are 99% of the community, can't have firearms, with the idea that you're really trying to get at the 1% who are already too young, or because they are felons, can't legally own firearms and are getting access to stolen and otherwise contraband firearms. So I think the supply control methodology is one that is problematic, and that the focus, again, if we were talking to our potential Democratic leaders, the focus ought to be on things that are demonstrated to have worked or have that potential, and that we ought to move away from things that are demonstrably failed policies.
Jennifer,
Great.
with all of that said, we seem as a society, or at least certain segments, to strongly embrace the role of policing as a way to address crime generally, gun crimes more specifically. But even there's a racial distinctions there. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to say with that. I guess in the kind of tidiest way to say it as it pertains to this conversation, one of the things, studying gun politics in the US, studying both sides of the gun debate and trying to unpack the different factions of people that are invested in this debate, one thing that I find extremely striking, particularly in the post-60s era of gun policy and gun politics, is how much both sides have been invested. And when I say both sides, I mean the national level, the gun rights led by the NRA side, and gun control led by, Brady, Everytown, that. So I'm really talking about those, and I know obviously it's much more nuanced, but when we see sort of the dominant voices and we listen to the dominant voices on gun policy, it all comes back to the police. It all comes back to enforce the laws. Gun policy has been intertwined with the expansion of the criminal justice state. And so either side kind of relies on the criminal justice system as sort of their, and we see this, even with the passage of gun control at the federal level in the early 90s, though the assault weapons ban was also part of a law that massively provided funds to police. Police were in favor of the assault weapons ban for reasons that I described earlier. And so, I think that in order to sort of get us beyond the current stage of the debate that we're at now, we really need to think about decentering criminal justice from how we think about the problem of gun violence and the issue of gun policy in this country. And so one of the things that hasn't been brought up, I mean, I totally agree with this point that Phil made about, we need to think about empowering communities. We need to think about economic and social circumstances within communities. I think it's very interesting. So I actually did a study that compared basically newspaper coverage, media coverage of the Bernard Goetz. It's a case in New York City with the George Zimmerman case in Florida. Obviously, these are cases that differ and are similar in a variety of ways, but they obviously are decades apart. And one of the striking things that I found in public discussions of those cases was that the conversation about economic justice, social well-being, community efficacy was present in the 1980s. It was basically absent by the time we got to the 2010s. And so I think that why we're not having that conversation is a huge question. But part of the reason we're not having that conversation is that our conversation about, all sorts of social issues has become more and more and more sort of overdetermined by a criminal justice approach. So I think that to the extent that we can imagine gun policy without the criminal justice system, that's the task before us. And I think that one of the ways that this has happened or could be happening, obviously, is with community intervention, gun violence intervention initiatives that are community organized, community embedded. Of course, the issue, though, is, so these are actually part of Biden's, he says he's going to fund these and give, tons of money to these types of organizations. Of course, just as with, Clinton in the early 90s, it's all attached with money to buttress the police, to buttress policing, to fund the criminal justice system. And so in some ways, this kind of dance that Democrats have done in terms of trying to, addressing gun policy, but then also buttressing through the buttressing of the criminal justice system, we're seeing that, seeing that unfold again. And so, I kind of haven't explicitly talked about the main gist of your question, which is, how this all adds up to racial disparities in terms of, in terms of everything from, violent victimization to arrest, incarceration, and all of the sort of harms that come out of contact with the criminal justice system. Obviously, the bloating the criminal justice system is has largely been detrimental to communities of color, particularly African American communities. And so solving or addressing gun policy with that tool is not going to lead to some imagined racial justice that I think it's often sort of kind of brushed off as that's going to be the outcome.
Thank you. So Phil,
Yes.
could you tell us a little bit about NAGA and why would you found an organization when we already had the NRA?
Sure. Very simply, I was looking for something culturally, first and foremost, that could speak to African Americans across this country. I felt it was incredibly important that we had a organization that, one, teaches us how to shoot a gun, of course, obviously going over the basics, the fundamentals, but putting that aside, gave us a bridge that we can talk about the issues that we want to talk about the way we want to talk about them. That was critically important. That combined with the history of Black arms that we put together for every NAGA member when they're coming on board gives us a very unique perspective in that that when you're grabbing a gun at NAGA, you're not the first Black person, nor will you be the last. And there's a long history behind you of African Americans that have died and paid the ultimate price for you to stand here and shoot this gun at this particular range. That's a very, very powerful narrative. And we've been able to really push that narrative out publicly, and people have really grasped that desire to grab and belong to NAGA. We're averaging over 1,000 new members every month. They're coming from every aspect of America you can think of. We have doctors, lawyers, chemists, traders, we have brokers, we have nurses, teachers, ex-military, active military. So it gives us a very good, diverse base of folks who want to join NAGA.
Thank you.
Okay.
This may be an odd question. All right, so when I first started buying guns, I don't think my family thought I was crazy at the first gun. But 5 pistols in, AR, tactical shotgun, carbine, they thought something was definitely wrong with me. Though all of them acknowledged they all should probably have a gun in light of just what was going on in 2020, 2021. What are the dynamics, and maybe they're no different in Black communities and families than they are in other families, where if you don't own a gun, you don't know what it's like. You just think they're killing machines and nobody should have them. Are there some unique dynamics around the tensions in Black communities vis-a-vis gun owners and non-gun owners?
Okay, can I say something real quick, Gregory? One of the things that we've been able to do at NAGA, and I'm not beating my chest for NAGA, but this is in general. We have a term, we agree to disagree, but not disconnect in our organization. That means that if I run into somebody either on the street or on the range or wherever the case may be, and they have a definite different view of guns, I'm obligated to listen to his or her story to find out why they came to the decision that they come to and get their perspective in an honest, civil discussion. And in return, you're going to listen to my perspective and my story. When you're able to come together and have conversations with folks that don't necessarily agree, you can at least start a dialogue that can hopefully come to some type of consensus or a compromise, or in some cases, hey, you're going to believe what you're going to believe, and I'm going to believe what I'm going to believe. We're going to shake hands, we're going to walk away, and no one has really changed each other's mind, but it was a civil discourse. There was no violence, there were no things thrown at each other, and I think that's what's missing right now. Folks need to listen to one another on both sides of the aisle. Don't care what color you are, I don't care your sexual orientation, listen to the other person, and I think you'll get a lot further down the road.
So on the
Go
question, just on the question of whether it's different for Blacks, I mean, a little bit of this is just recapping some of the things we talked about before. You know, I think you do see, or at least historically have seen, a different approach depending on whether you're talking about Black folk who are rural or country versus urban. I think you also over time have seen a kind of reluctance, certainly in the 1960s, 1970s, reluctance of people to acknowledge openly that they have firearms. I think to some degree that transcends race, but it also has a significant race component to it. Paula McLean's work from the 1970s, I think to some degree reflects that. And the last part of this, I guess, is sort of, you know, personal to me. I mean, I grew up in Appalachia. I think everybody that I knew had guns. So I come at this culturally from the opposite perspective of that Bob was describing earlier, where he didn't know anyone who had guns. But the other phenomenon that I have seen, even when I go back home to the mountains and talk to folks, is that there is this kind of undercurrent where there will be guns in the house, but not everybody knows that there are guns in the house. So grandpop or dad or somebody, when they know that I do this work, will say, oh, well, let me show you something. And someone else in the house will say, I didn't know you had that. So I think that phenomenon also transcends race, but it also has a peculiar sort of race cast to it. And again, that difference, I think, is something that changes depending on what period of time you're sort of asking the question. The upside, I think, today is that groups like Phillips and others are taking people to the point where they can be candid and open about it. And I think Heller and McDonald have something to do with that. But I think this sort of grassroots upsurge in purchasing is one of the biggest elements that sort of validates the open conversation about it.
Thank you. David, could you talk about your evolution as a gun owner? I don't know where I read it. Maybe it was on your faculty webpage, or maybe it was an article. I don't remember, but it was interesting to me.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I grew up in blue bubble of the San Francisco Bay Area, political and cultural liberal, so I never saw, touched, or fired a gun until I was 42 years old, when I got to North Carolina, and it seemed like I was the only person in the state who didn't have a gun. So I thought, these things are dangerous. I better know how to use them, you know, to make them safe if I ever came across one. And ended up having the opportunity to go to the range. I really enjoyed myself, and so kind of got more into firearms ownership that way. And around the same time, I was also trying to find a research project that was totally different than what I had been studying before, which was religion. And little did I know I was getting into a different sort of religion and studying gun culture. But so my personal and professional trajectories kind of converged around then. I also had a disturbing experience in the parking lot of my apartment complex with my kids, which heightened my sense of a need to protect myself and them. And so I embarked on a research project on gun culture, which actually put myself kind of at the center of that story. And that's what I've been trying to work out over the past 10 years.
Thank you. So for those who are watching or listening, who are African American, never owned a gun, but now they're thinking about it, what are the things they need to be thinking about more broadly and doing? Anybody?
If there, let me just chime in. I think if you're a first-time potential buyer, before you buy that gun, do your research. Go Google, talk to folks that have guns, go to the gun range. It's probably the most important thing you can do, and talk to someone on the other side of that counter that's a certified instructor and get their perspective. What kind of gun is good for you based on your size, your strength, what they're going to be used for? Are you going to be using for strictly home defense, or do you want to carry as a single woman from your job to your car late at night? So everything depends, and it's really customized to you. So before you buy that gun and grab anything that's on the counter, talk to some professionals, talk to some individuals that have guns, and most importantly, kind of get a sense of what you are trying to do as a single person buying that gun. I think that's the best starting point that you can do.
Any additional thoughts?
But I think one of the things that I've come to realize, and I think most people that I know within gun culture realize, is that guns are dangerous. You know, if they weren't dangerous, they wouldn't be useful for most of the purposes that people want to put them to. And so, kind of echoing Philip's point is, you know, consider whether you personally have the right disposition, whether you're in the right circumstances in terms of children, potential mental illness in your family and household, and make good decisions within that context. And if you do choose to bring firearms into your home, it's your responsibility to make sure that no one who shouldn't have access to those firearms has access to them, whether it's someone in your household or someone from outside your household who gets into your household.
Anything else?
Well, I actually have a question for Philip, if that's okay.
Sure. Yes.
And Philip talked about the ways in which he tries to keep out the politics out of NAGA. You know, how he really tries to, you know, let people just, you know, learn how to shoot their guns and how to protect themselves. But I was wondering as to what Philip and others think about other organizations, such as the Huey P. Newton Gun Club, you know, which has, you know, in many ways a similar agenda, but is clearly very political, you know, but it also is an important organization. So I was just wondering as to what Philip thought about organizations such as the Huey P. Newton Gun Club, and whether you thought about cooperating with them, and what other African Americans who own guns think about such organizations. You're muted.
Sorry about that, I had myself on mute. It's a great question, Simon. What we typically try to do at NAGA is to be as neutral as possible. And just to kind of give you guys some perspective, we have over 40,000 members. So we all come from different perspectives, different backgrounds, but I try to really keep everybody in the middle, in terms of when you come to NAGA, you can be who you are, relax, and we are going to be respected. We're going to give you a hug and a high five, say, welcome, brother, welcome, sister, and you can learn how to shoot a gun. If you want to talk about politics, you can. If you don't want to, you don't have to. That formula has made NAGA grow exponentially because folks outside of our community are joining, as well as African Americans. And I think that's a very good commentary on the substance of the organization. Now, to your point, when it comes to other firearm organizations, I respect everybody. We all have different agendas. We all have different perspectives. But with NAGA, I try to let them do their thing. Obviously, I'm aware as the president of what they're doing, be it any organization that's out there. But for us specifically, sometimes it's better just to kind of say, you do your thing and we'll do ours, and respect them for their own walk in life as they're going forward.
So I asked my questions. Are there other big questions that linger amongst the panelists and or the guests, either in the chat or via Twitter? Anybody can have at it.
They're going to come hot and heavy now.
So I'll ask another question then. What's the future hold for Black gun ownership? Next 10 to 15 years, what are we going to see?
I think it's going to be great. I think you're going to see African Americans growing and growing in terms of gun ownership. And I'll say this, and I'm not a predictor of the future, but I have a strong indication that our political leadership will change according to the waves that are coming down the pipeline. because the old narrative of anti-gun, if you have to be aligned with this particular party, I think those days are soon to be over.
Jennifer, are you as optimistic? I see my main gun instructor as an attendee, and I took him for a number of classes, for my concealed carry class, and he said, you know, when the police pull you over and they run your tags, they'll know you have concealed carry permit, give them a permit, give them your license and registration, have a nice conversation, you'll be on your way. I raised my hand, I said, does that go for the Black people in the audience as well? He said, well, I got a different narrative for you. So the question is, will policing change to any great extent in their engagement with the Black community vis-a-vis whites, especially around guns over the next decade or so? What do you suspect?
Yeah, I mean, I think that going back to the Philando Castile case, there are many tragic elements of that, absolutely tragic elements of that case. And one of the tragedies in that case was that there was a real opportunity with that case to have a different kind of public conversation about guns, gun rights, race, and policing in this country. And the NRA refused to have that conversation. You had this there was this weird period where, you know, you had the New York Times talking about basically saying, well, gun rights should be universal. Why are they not? You had people in the National Review saying this is a right, and how can police if this isn't an egregious act of infringement by police, I don't know what is. So you have this moment where everybody finally, despite sort of our political differences, or I shouldn't say everybody, many people are seeing the same thing across the political spectrum, and that just vanishes. That just goes away, and we never have that conversation. And so I think until we, and I say we, knowing that this country is very divided, we're fractured. Until we can have that conversation, I am not hopeful. That being said, though, I do think that there's a lot of movement, and there's a lot of moving parts in terms of you know, policing and guns and gun violence and lawful self-defense and all of these things. And I think that to the extent that we try and separate those things and talk about police over here and police, you know, and what have you, we're not going to be making headway. And so I think the fact that we're having this conversation and pulling all these elements together, I think is super powerful. And yeah, I actually think that you know, David earlier made this great point about, you know, not every gun owner is a gun owner, is politically sort of identified with the fact that they own a gun, and that's core to their political identity. I interviewed gun sellers all last year about, you know, the massive explosion in diversity on many counts of new customers coming into their stores buying guns. And yeah, I think that, you know, in some ways this is a very interesting moment where gun culture, again, using a monolithic term for something that's super complex, might be transformed, or we might go back to sort of the same coordinates that have been sort of set in stone since, you know, especially since the 1990s, in terms of, you know, gun rights as, you know, as aligned with the Republican Party, as a conservative agenda, you know, part of the conservative agenda. So yeah, I would say that in some ways I'm less hopeful. In some ways I'm hopeful in the sense that I think there is a lot of there's a lot of opportunity to kind of harness and think through and transform what gun culture is in this country, and who's a part of it, and who gets to own it as an agenda item. And I actually think that, you know, going back to the question of, you know, what are the Democrats doing on this? I think that in some ways, you know, there's been so much of a focus on what is actually maybe not as narrow as it's often publicly portrayed, but a relatively narrow sort of engagement with guns, obviously, in terms of a prohibitive you know, agenda with regard to gun control. And I think if we switch to sort of understanding, accepting guns are in, like, we have Heller, we have McDonald, who knows what's gonna, you know, what's gonna happen in the next year with the Supreme Court. We have, you know, millions and millions of guns in circulation. So how do we engage that reality instead of engaging some other reality that I can't actually see being effective in terms of how things are, how things have played out, especially in the last year with the surge in gun purchasing.
This doesn't have to do with race, and thank you for that, Jennifer. how do we get people to move beyond purchasing guns to actually investing time and energy into training with them? Because when I go to my gun store and they're selling all these guns, I ask the question, what percentage of your customers do you think actually come back here and go to the range? And they're like, small percentage.
There's
Yeah,
sorry.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I mean, that's a really interesting question because I think it really illustrates sort of how the advocates of gun control have been kind of behind the ball in terms of not seeing where the wind is blowing and addressing like what the actual situation is with regard to the appeal and sort of the politics of guns on the ground. And you know, it's interesting to me that so when I did my research in Michigan, it was all about concealed carry and open carry. I heard a lot of stories about the people who opposed Michigan's concealed carry legislation, which required training to get a concealed pistol license. And you had, you know, basically the Michigan militia, which were like, you know, no government infringement, a license is, you know, that's bad, we don't want that. And then you had gun control advocates, you know, basically on the same side protesting, although obviously for starkly different reasons. But what was interesting is that you would, if you could read the writing on the wall that, you know, these laws are being passed throughout the country, you know, what would actually have been a much more effective stance was to get in on that decision-making process and ensure that the training requirements were as rigorous as they should be, right? And I know training requirements are controversial within the Second Amendment community, and so that's another, you know, can of worms. But I think that is an example of, you know, there are these opportunities where if maybe people would be thinking a little bit more creatively and a little bit more in terms of consensus and what is feasible, those kinds of concerns could be addressed.
I wonder if there's actually a link between our previous conversation about Fernando Castillo, the issue of training, and also the original notion of the Second Amendment, which is, for most of the 20th century, I think most, certainly urban police departments, have grown up in an era where they saw the world in terms of victims and perpetrators, and not citizens who were empowered to defend themselves, and who in fact are an asset or a resource in terms of the safety of a community. Maybe what we should be going to our police departments and saying, one, we want you to do the training, and we also want to train you to recognize, in fact, that the population is armed. It's quite legitimate that they be armed. And how do you work to avoid situations where you're shooting innocent people because you don't recognize that these are, in fact, legitimate individuals who are armed for their own defense? That one of the things we may not want to start reconsidering is breaking down the wall between the armed civilian and the police department, and say, we need to have you trained together so that both of you know each other's perspective, and you recognize that this is a legitimate part of modern American life, that the citizen is armed, prepared to protect herself, and prepared also to assist the police under certain circumstances. We should be doing more in terms of expanding police auxiliaries and police reserves, so that we don't have an insular culture of police who see themselves as something different from the citizenry.
On
Robert
that
made
line,
a
go
sorry.
ahead, Simon.
Yeah, well, I think Robert made an important point, but Gregory too alluded to something that that really concerns me, looking at all this obviously from the outside. And I'm wondering as to whether Black citizens are faced with a damned if they do, damned if they don't situation. I mean, the African-American citizens have to protect themselves, so they need to purchase firearms. But if they do, and you mentioned it, Gregory, you know, if they are armed and they encounter white authorities, what the result is can be a very dangerous situation. So, and I'm wondering as to whether more firearms in the hands of African Americans might mean more fatal encounters with white authorities. And as I said, I'm just looking at this from the outside, but I'm just afraid that that might be a result of this surge in purchase among Black citizens?
Jennifer, yeah.
Yeah, and I kind of want to segue to Nick because I feel like you have the answer, one of the answers to this, because I think it's so there's multiple, there's multiple issues going on here, and I think with regard to, when we talk about police harassment, police violence, all of these things, part of the problem here isn't. I mean, yes, okay, there's training issues and what have you, but part of the issue is a structural issue of how much police contact there is that is unnecessary. And Nick, you've written about this, that actually one simple way to actually reduce the conditions of possibility for these heinous incidents is to actually minimize police civilian contact and really and again I mean you didn't call it you wrote this article several years ago and before defund the police, but in some ways that is rolling back sort of police and sort of rethinking what is the role of police in society in such a way that we can minimize violent outcomes.
So, thanks for the prompt, Jennifer. So I was sitting here earlier thinking, there are concrete technical interventions that I believe can work here. The first thing that I was thinking when Greg initially asked the question was that not only is the gun a powerful tool of self-defense, but the cell phone and the cell phone camera is a powerful tool for purposes of constraining government and shining a light on abusive government activity. I mean, so Black people have been getting beaten up by police for decades. When we saw Rodney King being beaten by police, it was a dramatic shift in our consciousness of that sort of thing, because now people couldn't deny it and it didn't have to go through the filter of after the fact police accounts. The same thing is true for the Castile case. But the point, so that's the pitch for the power of the camera, which we all now have in our available to us to take video. The piece that Jennifer is referring to is something that occurred to me many years ago, and I wrote this piece for a book that Jennifer and Kristen Gross did a couple of years ago. And the argument that I made at the time was that we should again urge legislators to utilize, not a fan of the defunding concept, but that we should urge legislators to implement technological interventions that just minimize the possibility that someone with a firearm approaches my car to implement one of these trivial provisions of the modern administrative state. So plate readers and a variety of other interventions would allow us to approach lots of these trivial contacts in a way that would minimize or eliminate the possibility of a traffic stop escalating into the sort of shooting that we saw in the Castile case. And I won't belabor all of the details, but there are multiple interventions of this type, including utilizing algorithms to eliminate cash bail, which we know has a devastating effect on people who ultimately turn out to be innocent. They get into this sort of cascade of problems that then causes them ultimately to be permanently economically disabled. And that's a world, I think, that suggests a great deal of promise in terms of solutions to these problems that are partly a consequence of police with warrior mentality or command presence kind of instructions, approaching people who are rightly sort of affronted by the idea that the absence of a blinker now has them laying face down on the ground and being roughed up in ways that we would not countenance in any other context. So I actually am a bit hopeful that our great technological tools that are unfolding in the current era will ultimately be a basis for improving things in this context.
So this is going to be my last question. So the past is prologue, and this is actually a question from one of the an individual in the chat, but also on Twitter. The past is prologue. African Americans face substantial threats from white mobs, white supremacists, white nationalists over the generations, and it's on the rise again. So with that said, should traditional civil rights organizations take up the support of African Americans arming themselves for defense and gun rights?
I would hope so. That was the traditional approach of the NAACP for the first 50 years of the organization's existence, and the organization cut its teeth defending people who used guns in self-defense. And up until the 1970s, when we see this beginning of this sort of alliance between the gun control national gun control movement and the sort of traditional civil rights organizations, there was nothing incompatible between the civil rights agenda and private self-defense.
In fact, I recall an ad that was put out by Handgun Control Incorporated. It was sometime in the 90s. And it was before, and I think it was advocating for the assault weapons ban of 1994. It had a picture of a Klansman with what was purported to be an AR-15, and it said, "Why does the NRA want him to have an AR-15?" I wish I had had the money to run a counter ad. My ad would have had the same photo, but it would have said, no matter what the law says, when the time comes, he will have a fully automatic M16. Wouldn't you like to be able to own a semi-automatic AR-15?
I think one of the reasons for the rise of there's actually two national liberal gun owners groups is to try to fill that traditional civil libertarian kind of position with respect to firearms. So, fully embracing, being liberal, but also fully embracing the right to keep and bear arms. So I think those groups are gaining some momentum. Obviously, they're nowhere on the level of some other organizations like the NRA, but they are trying to fill that gap.
So we have about 8 minutes, and why don't I let each of the panelists take about a minute to offer their individual closing remarks. I'll start as I began. Let me start with Phil. What would you like our audience to know? What would you like to say?
First of all, I just want to thank. Sure. First of all, thank you to all the panelists. Thank you, Greg. This has been really good. We need more of this. I really enjoy the conversation and the different strategies and perspectives. I think this is a very healthy thing that we're doing here. Regarding gun and the future of guns, I think, as I said before, I think if we work together collectively and have common sense lead the day, I think we'll be in a better place. Doesn't know exactly where we're going to end up, but I think it will certainly be in a better place where we are moving down the road. But I just want to thank everyone in closing for the time and the great comments that we've had here today.
Thank you. Jennifer?
Yeah, I'll just echo, thank you so much for inviting me on this panel. This has been a really fascinating conversation. I've learned a lot, and reading the chat has been amazing. So thank you everybody in the audience who's been chatting. Someone said, is anybody reading these? Yes, we are reading them. We can see everything. So thank you everyone who's come, panelists and audience, with such engaged attention to this issue. And yeah, I mean, as far as closing remarks, I think that this whole panel, the whole past 2 hours, has really shown just how nuanced and dynamic guns in America and race and guns in America is. And so, I hope that we can all look at this moment as not just sort of we spent the last year thinking about crisis, uncertainty, chaos, but there's a lot of possibility also in all of that. And so I hope that we can come away from this panel with that in mind.
Thank you, Jennifer. Bob?
Well, first, I'd like to thank you for the invitation, and also my fellow panelists for an absolutely fascinating and valuable conversation. This is a fascinating issue, and it's a difficult one. I think it's one that we we have to approach, which all too often does not occur, with sensitivity to nuance and to the fact that this is a multifaceted conversation. We do have to keep in mind also, as we talk about race and guns, that we are doing it against the background of a tragic story of Black on Black violence in America, one which is in part due to economic and social neglect, and also in part a history of ignoring violence within the Black community on the part of authorities, which I think has brought us to a tragic impasse. But I think one of the things we do have to keep in mind is the idea that the right to self-defense is the most fundamental right of all.
Thank you. Nicholas?
So this is just more appreciation, but it just reminded me years ago, I was on a dais with Roy Ennis, who turned and looked at me and said, well, my goodness, look at you. I was feeling like the Lone Ranger up here, he was always the only Black guy on the panel. And I can remember when I started doing this work, maybe a quarter century ago, a long time ago. It's my colleagues looked at me like they're expecting I was going to grow a second head. It was a bizarre idea. So I am quite encouraged by the panel that you put on here today, and happy to be among this group of thoughtful and sort of widely varied panelists. So thanks.
Thank you. Simon?
Yeah, I would also like to say thank you, Gregory, for putting this together. I know it was a lot.
Oh no, the first time he froze. Maybe we'll come back to him. David?
Yeah, so I think that with respect to African-American gun ownership in general, I would simply observe as a takeaway that we have seen a kind of marginal growth in African-American gun owners, followed by a tremendous acceleration sort of post Philando Castile and Trump, and particularly in the great gun buying spree of the COVID George Floyd presidential election year. And I think that gradual growth will continue insofar as the more that grows, the more that groups like NAGA grow, the more normal gun ownership will seem in the African-American community. But with respect to the dramatic growth in the past 18 months, I wonder whether we might see a large number of former gun owners over the next few years, in the same way that we'll see a large number of former Peloton owners or former Airstream owners, as people rushed into purchasing firearms in the same way they rush into some of these other things, and then they realize that's not going to really be part of their lifestyle. But I think the gradual growth of African-American gun ownership is definitely here to stay.
I want to thank Phil, Jennifer, Bob, Nicholas, Simon, David for participating in this conversation. I want to thank all the guests who logged on. And I want to thank especially Amelia Kennedy and Arlene McClannon here at Wake Forest University School of Law for all their diligent work in helping to put this together and working on a Saturday. I did not ask them to, but they, teamwork makes the dream work, and so they both pitched in. I got to go buy them something nice, and they helped out here. From here on out, we will edit this video, and we will share it in various spaces and places. I will also send an email to all of those who registered with links to everybody's book on guns, and some other links to research that those of you have conducted. I will certainly send out a link, Phil, to how folks can become members of NAGA, and I look forward to more conversations down the road. I appreciate you guys.